Next up, we've got Professor Mike Sathekge, who's coming from University of Pretoria. He'll be discussing what PSMA Theranostics will look like in 5 years' time. Thank you.
Thank you so kindly, David, and thanks, Mike, for inviting us here. This is good because somebody has to speak about alpha. I mean, we have been hearing the betas, but I mean, I like the fact that indeed it has been spoken to about what are the things that can predict how we are going to be successful in theragnostic, and then of course, what is the mechanisms of resistance. This has been shown, but it has been shown in the context of the betas. So how do we do it in the alphas? That is what I want to take us through, the steps that are essential, because that is where we will be in 2020, in 5 years. I do think alphas will actually be having quite a big share in terms of what we do. Of course, it will be in terms of trying to work with it alone, but together with the betas, and my colleague Marisa will also be speaking about this, but also when we do have a lutetium that has been given, after when do you now start to engage the alphas? But for that to happen, I think it's essential that we actually then get to understand the advantages and disadvantages of the alphas. Clearly, we know about the high linear energy transfer that is good with the alphas. And then, of course, we know that it is a short path length. But then, of course, Ziting has just spoken about the education now. The education is going to be critical, but it's also important that we have to speak about the revolution. I mean, we have to change the mindset of what are we going to do about the alphas. It can't be the betas only, so that has to come into effect. But and of course, we must speak to the regulators. But people will criticize and say, you're speaking about the alphas, but there is problems of the supply. I just want to highlight that indeed, clearly you can see that indeed there has been progress. It's no longer going to be thorium-only approach. And as you can see that the radium approach, it ticks almost all the boxes except the timing. Whilst the thorium, there was the problem of the supply. So the two will then balance each other. And my prediction is that, of course, by next year, at least the colleagues that cannot give the alphas will actually be able to do so. So this is comforting because that's what we normally get the criticism on. So, but of course, the other criticism is on the dosimetry. So now that we can actually learn how to image the alphas, that's going to be critical, as you can see from these images. But we also can contribute into the fact that the daughters with the recoil is not much of a problem, as you can see from Zguro's work, that actually the lesions have got much higher uptake. So you actually don't have to worry much about the bismuth, which is one of the daughters. And that's one of the important things to actually note in this particular instance. So the dosimetry, yes, microdosimetry is what is critical, but I think it's getting addressed. So, and then of course, everyone speaks about what is happening about the immunity here. But immunological effects are actually much more interesting with the alphas than with the betas. And that's what we have to realize, that actually to induce the immune response that we're speaking about, and especially if we're going to speak about futuristically the tumor microenvironment, it is going to be more appreciated with the alphas, and that's something that if we're speaking about the combination therapies, this is actually the space to go into. And this is actually, as you can see, the dump here, the damaged patterns of the cells, they really induce much more distant immune responses than you actually can appreciate with the beta. So if that is the case, then I'll come to speak about it a bit later. But I just want to highlight the recent study that we've just done about the actinium, wherein at least it's not one center. Yes, we still have a criticism of having retrospective studies in the alphas, but at least it's multiple centers here. And in here, we are saying that, yes, we have seen that the alphas, especially actinium, it does actually offer an anti-tumor effect. But really, indeed, this study is the largest with 488 patients. And then, of course, the study does add the value in that it actually shows other patterns that may make actinium not to be as successful as well. And then, of course, at least it is something that can then open open the doors for prospective studies. In this, we have demonstrated that the overall survival, it's with at least 7 centers, it's 15.5, and then of course at least 8 months of overall survival. But then if you separate the responders versus non-responders, the overall survival is actually more than that. It's 2 years. So which means the first slide that I've shown, which is coming from your work here, Mike, and then the colleagues here, that indeed, if we select them well, we can actually even go to more than that. And there's anecdotal work of showing that it can actually go to 5. We have demonstrated, however, that in this study that clearly you can see that if the patient has had chemotherapy, that becomes a problem. So they really have a market reduced overall survival, and that's really, as you can see clearly, that 2 years versus 9 months, it's a bit of a problem. But clearly the PSA 50 reduction is also critical in this particular instance, because then that's a good predictor, and that's something that we actually have to take note of in this particular instance. But the patient that have gotten lutetium, because that's mostly going to be most of them. So what does lutetium, if it's given in much more cycles, do? As you can see, low linear energy transfer, the traversing of it, what does it do to make the patient to be less responsive to actinium? It's something we have to learn, and the radiobiology is much more interesting. As you can see again here that we have 18 versus, then that's something that we actually will learn as we go forward. But of course, there is no free lunch. As you can see clearly, the criticism is that we do induce xerostomia here, and the xerostomia is a problem. Of course, we had 2% that had actually dropped out of the study, and then almost all the patients will have xerostomia if you give repeated cycles. But almost at the first cycle, around 70 will have xerostomia, but that's manageable. That's something that we're working on, to give drugs that will reduce the circulation to those areas, and that's something that it's going to come here. And of course, we hardly have any hematotoxicities. That is the biggest advantage that we have to take note. That's the short path length, the hematotoxicities are actually not a factor, and that's what I'll come to. Louise and myself here are actually the PIs for Australia, South Africa, for the study that is going to start. And doing the criticism of not having the prospective studies, we will recommend the dose, and then of course, between 8 and 10, probably those will go, and it might be dependent on what you actually do in this particular instance. And then of course, if we then know the dose, then we can speak about what we had been speaking about, the earlier use of actinium and the earlier use of lutetium. We have had, unfortunately, because of the lack of availability, the use of chemotherapy, naive, and then the de novo, and then the post-ADT. And then there are some market responses, but of course we have to understand them better. The one thing that also getting a good dose does, as you can see with the antibodies, actinium tends to work better, of course, for this particular instance in terms of reducing the hematotoxicities, even with the antibodies. And it has less xerostomia. So this is another way of opening up the alpha use in 5 years' time. But I just want to show this, that as we give ADT, and I'm glad you spoke about ADT, that we have to remember that it actually does contribute to the neuroendocrine differentiation. And if we do that, then we must have tracers that would actually do this. And the neurotensin 1 receptor is actually one of those that we have to keep mind of. But similarly, this opens the doors that we can use the alphas to label them with the FAPs, to label them with the bombazine. And that might be another way of bringing the neuroendocrine and the PSMA negative patients that we might want to look into. To run faster, unfortunately, you've spoken about the PRINs, but as I've spoken about the immune response, the immune response will be much more appreciated. Can't go into the details. So therefore, it means there might be better appreciation actually because of the short path length. If that is appreciated with lutetium, that could be appreciated with the alphas. Your study, the ENZA-P, I think it will be much. It's something futuristically that we must look into. That the alphas in various ways, at least the lead and then the actinium might actually be of use, because especially in the post-lutetium patients, because then you can enhance the uptake and then give the alphas, and that might actually be another way of looking at this. But as you look at the loop up, people might argue that you don't need a loop up in actinium in this case, but actually we need it because actually that will have a positive spin back, and then it will actually be much more impactful if you look at the pathophysiology. Then the patients might actually benefit much. And remember that the toxicities will be reduced in this particular, that is of course excluding the salivary glands if you were to look on this. So my last slide is that, of course, as you can see here that I mean, the message is that we have to do it well. We have to have the education, the regulators well. But if you look at the first slide in red and the last slide, I mean, we can never go anywhere. Life begins when fear ends. As you can see, the lion being the cancer here, it is about time that actually we face it. So if you know the lion, if you face it head on, it actually backs off, and that's what we have to do with the cancer here, and specifically with targeted alpha therapy. Thank you.